Cheyenne Station, Wyoming Territory, October 1886. When schoolteacher Eleanor Grant dropped her mother's treasured book while boarding the westbound train, she never imagined anyone would notice. But ranch hand Daniel Cole found it on the platform with her name inscribed inside, along with pressed wildflowers and a destination: Silver Creek, 100 miles into the mountains. Most men would have left it with the stationmaster. Daniel saddled his horse and rode through early snowstorms to return what wasn't his. What began as a simple act of decency would prove that sometimes the longest journeys lead to exactly where we're meant to be. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Treasure. The morning of October 12, 1886, arrived cold and sharp at Cheyenne Station. Steam billowed from the locomotive like a dragon's breath, while passengers crowded the platform, clutching tickets and bundles. The Wyoming wind carried the smell of coal smoke and distant sage, cutting through wool coats as if they were made of paper. Eleanor Grant stood among the chaos, 24 years old and trying not to look as nervous as she felt. Her traveling bag sat heavy against her hip, packed with everything she owned that mattered: 2 dresses, teaching supplies, her mother's silver locket, and a worn book of poetry that had belonged to her mother before consumption claimed her 3 years prior. The conductor's voice boomed across the platform, announcing final boarding for the westbound train. Eleanor gathered her skirts and hurried toward the passenger car, weaving between families, saying goodbye, and merchants loading freight. In her haste, she failed to notice when the leather strap of her bag slipped open, or when the small volume tumbled out and landed with a soft thud on the weathered planks. She found her seat by the window and pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching Cheyenne begin to shrink behind her. Her father's final words still rang in her ears, spoken 3 days prior in their Philadelphia parlor, about foolish girls who threw away respectable futures for romantic notions of Western adventure. He had promised her a suitable marriage to a banker's son, a comfortable home, a predictable life. Eleanor had chosen uncertainty instead. Miles away, as the train became a dark smudge against the morning sky, Daniel Cole crossed the platform with his saddle slung over one shoulder. At 28, he carried himself with the particular weariness of a man who had worked hard and lost everything anyway. 2 years of drifting between cattle drives and ranch work had left him lean, sunburned, and searching for something he couldn't name. His boot nearly stepped on the book before he noticed it. He paused, glancing around to see if anyone had dropped it recently, but the platform was already emptying. Most travelers had either boarded or returned to town. Daniel crouched down and picked up the small volume, its cover worn smooth by countless readings. The book fell open naturally to pages marked by pressed wildflowers, delicate blue columbines and yellow prairie sunflowers, their colors faded but still recognizable. Daniel's calloused fingers touched the petals carefully, understanding immediately that someone had preserved these with intention. Each flower represented a moment worth remembering. Inside the front cover, written in 2 different hands, was a history. The first inscription read in elegant script, "To my dearest Eleanor, may these words bring you comfort when I cannot. Your loving mother, Margaret Grant, Christmas 1883. Below it, in newer ink, was written, Eleanor Grant, Silver Creek School, Silver Creek, Wyoming Territory. Daniel closed the book and looked toward the tracks where the train had disappeared. The stationmaster was closing up the ticket window, preparing for the long wait until the next arrival. Daniel could leave the book with him. That would be the sensible thing. But something about those pressed flowers and the mother's inscription made him hesitate. This wasn't just any book. This was memory made tangible, love preserved between pages. Silver Creek sat roughly 100 miles northwest, deep in the mountain territory where October weather turned treacherous without warning. The rational part of his mind listed all the reasons not to go: limited provisions, uncertain weather, a stranger's carelessness creating obligation where none existed. But Daniel had spent 2 years drifting through other people's ranches, sleeping in bunkhouses that would never be home, working land that would never be his. Here, at least, was something concrete, a simple task with a clear destination. Return what was lost. Make something right in a world that had felt wrong for too long. Daniel walked to the general store and purchased what he would need for the journey. Then he headed to the livery, tucked the wrapped book carefully into his saddlebag, and turned his horse's head northwest toward the mountains. 100 miles through October weather to return a book to a stranger. Most people would call it foolish. But as his horse found its rhythm on the trail, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 years. Purpose. Chapter 2. 100 miles between. The first day took Daniel through rolling grassland where the wind moved like invisible water across endless prairie. October had painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber. The summer green faded to the color of old parchment. He kept Cisco, his buckskin gelding, to a steady pace, knowing the horse would need his strength for the mountain passages ahead. By afternoon, clouds began building along the northern horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of early snow. Daniel had spent enough seasons working cattle drives to recognize the particular quality of light that preceded a storm. The air grew thick and still, pressing against his skin like something solid. That evening, he made camp near a creek that ran clear and cold from mountain snowmelt. While Cisco grazed nearby, hobbled but content, Daniel built a small fire and boiled coffee in his dented tin pot. After eating a sparse meal of hardtack and jerky, he pulled out the book. He hadn't intended to read it. The book belonged to someone else, after all. But curiosity won over propriety, and Daniel opened to a random page. The poetry spoke of resilience, of seeds that split stone to reach sunlight, of rivers that carved canyons through sheer persistence. The words were simple but carried weight, each line carefully chosen. In the margins, written in what must have been the mother's hand, were small notes. "Read this to Eleanor when she doubts herself," one said. Another, "Remember, my darling, that strength comes quietly." Daniel traced the faded ink, thinking about a woman who knew she was dying and wanted to leave guidance behind for the daughter who would face the world alone. He understood that impulse. His own mother had done something similar in her final months, teaching him to mend fences properly, showing him which stars to navigate by, making sure he knew how to survive when she could no longer help him survive. Those practical lessons had been her way of saying she loved him when grief made other words impossible. The ranch had been in his family for 2 generations before debt and drought stripped it away. His father's death had started the collapse. His mother's grief had finished it, and Daniel had been left with nothing but the skills to work other people's land. Daniel read until the fire burned low, then carefully wrapped the book and tucked it back into his saddlebag. He rolled himself in his blanket beneath a sky, so thick with stars they looked like spilled salt, and fell asleep thinking about the kind of woman who pressed wildflowers into poetry books. The second day brought him into the foothills where ponderosa pines replaced prairie grass, and the air grew thin enough to notice. The trail climbed steadily, switchbacking up slopes where loose shale made every step treacherous. Cisco picked his way carefully, ears swiveling forward as if listening for danger. By midday, the storm that had been threatening finally arrived. Snow began falling in thick, wet flakes that clung to Daniel's hat and shoulders. Within an hour, visibility dropped to mere yards. The trail disappeared beneath fresh powder while wind drove the snow sideways, stinging exposed skin. Daniel found shelter beneath an overhang of rock where wind had carved a shallow cave from the mountainside. He led Cisco into the protected space, unsaddled him, and rubbed the horse down with dry cloth from his pack. The storm raged through the afternoon and into the evening, transforming the world into a howling void of white. When the storm finally broke near midnight, it left behind a landscape transformed. Snow covered everything in pristine white, beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. The temperature dropped sharply now that the clouds had cleared, and travel would become even more difficult. The third morning arrived crystalline and cold. Progress slowed to a crawl as Cisco struggled through drifts that reached his chest. By noon, Daniel realized the horse was limping. His heart sank as he examined Cisco's right foreleg and found heat and swelling around the fetlock. Not broken, thank God, but strained badly enough that continuing to ride would risk permanent injury. Daniel stood in the middle of a snow-covered trail, 15 miles from Silver Creek, according to his best guess, with a lame horse and dwindling supplies. He looked at his saddlebag where the book waited, wrapped in canvas and protected like the precious cargo it was. He thought about pressed flowers and a mother's handwriting, about a daughter who had already lost so much. He fashioned a lead rope and began walking, leading Cisco gently through the snow. 15 miles on foot through mountain terrain would take hours, possibly all night. But he had come this far. Turning back now felt like surrender, and Daniel had surrendered enough in his life already. The sun tracked across the sky while Daniel trudged forward, one step after another. His legs burned, his lungs ached from the thin air, and his fingers had gone numb inside his gloves. But he didn't stop. As evening deepened toward night, Daniel finally saw it, a cluster of lights twinkling in the valley below. Silver Creek. The town sat nestled against the mountainside, smoke rising from chimneys into the darkening sky. He had made it, 100 miles through October storms to return a book to a woman he had never met. Chapter 3. The Woman Worth the Journey. Morning arrived clear and sharp, the kind of October day where sunlight made the fresh snow glitter like scattered diamonds. Daniel woke in the boarding house stiff and sore from 3 days in the saddle and 15 miles on foot. Every muscle protested as he pulled on his boots, but he felt oddly satisfied. He had completed the journey. Now came the simpler task of returning what he had found. After a quick breakfast of eggs and coffee that tasted better than anything he had eaten on the trail, Daniel walked toward the schoolhouse. The building sat modest and sturdy at the edge of town, a single-room log structure with a chimney that already leaked smoke into the morning air. Someone had shoveled a path through the snow to the front steps, and windows glowed warm with lamplight. Daniel waited outside, not wanting to interrupt lessons. Through the wavy glass, he could see movement, a woman in a simple gray dress moving among rows of children. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, but even from a distance, he could see the animated way she gestured while teaching, using her whole body to communicate enthusiasm for whatever subject held the children's attention. He listened to the muffled sound of young voices reciting something in unison, then laughter, then quiet again as the teacher's voice rose and fell in explanation. Daniel found himself reluctant to interrupt this scene of ordinary education, this small miracle of learning happening in a rough mountain town that had probably started as a mining camp just a few years prior. When the door finally opened and children spilled out into the snow, Daniel stepped aside to let them pass. They ran and shouted and threw snowballs with the particular energy of youth released from confinement. A few curious glances came his way, the stranger with trail dust still on his coat and a saddlebag over his shoulder. The teacher appeared in the doorway, a small bell in her hand as she called after the departing students. Her voice carried clearly in the cold air, warm, firm, touched with humor. She turned to go back inside and nearly collided with Daniel, standing at the bottom of the steps. Eleanor Grant looked up at him with startled brown eyes that held both intelligence and wariness. She was smaller than he had imagined, maybe 5 feet and a few inches, with a face that carried the kind of beauty that came from character rather than conventional prettiness. Fine lines marked the corners of her eyes from squinting at books in poor light, and her hands bore ink stains that spoke of countless hours spent writing. Daniel removed his hat and introduced himself, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the canvas-wrapped bundle. He explained finding it at Cheyenne Station 3 days ago. For a moment, Eleanor simply stared at the package, not comprehending. Then recognition dawned across her face like sunrise, and she took the bundle with trembling hands. She unwrapped it carefully, and when the familiar worn cover appeared, she made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She pressed the book against her chest with both hands, her eyes squeezing shut. When she opened them again, tears had gathered but not fallen. She explained how she had noticed it missing when they stopped in Rawlins, how she had looked everywhere, questioned the conductor, and checked under every seat. She had thought it was lost forever. Eleanor looked up at him properly then, truly seeing him for the first time. Her voice caught with disbelief as she calculated the distance. Over 100 miles. Daniel confirmed it was 103 by his count, then added simply that the book seemed important. Eleanor laughed, though the sound caught in her throat. This was all she had left of her mother, she explained. The notes in the margins, the pressed flowers they had picked together, the marked passages her mother wanted her to remember. When she realized it was gone, she had felt like she lost her mother all over again. She opened the book with reverent care, checking that everything remained intact. The pressed flowers were there, slightly more flattened from travel, but still recognizable. The handwritten notes remained legible. Nothing had been damaged in the journey. Eleanor noted that he must have ridden through the storm that started 2 days ago, and that he could have been killed in those passes. Daniel admitted the possibility, but downplayed the danger, saying his horse was sound and he knew mountain weather well enough. Eleanor studied him with an expression that suggested she was revising her initial assessment. Whatever she saw in his weathered face and honest eyes seemed to satisfy some internal question. She insisted on thanking him properly, inviting him to the boarding house where she stayed for supper. Mrs. Peterson always made enough to feed an army, she said with a smile that transformed her entire face from merely pretty to genuinely lovely. Daniel's stomach responded before his mouth could form a polite refusal. Eleanor introduced herself properly, insisting he call her by her first name, since anyone who rides 100 miles through snow to return her mother's memory deserved first-name courtesy. Mrs. Peterson's boarding house proved exactly as advertised: warm, welcoming, and presided over by a woman who could extract life stories from stones if given enough time. Over plates of beef stew and fresh bread, Daniel found himself talking more than he had in months, telling stories of his family's lost ranch, his years of drifting, and the impulsive decision to ride 100 miles to return a book to a stranger. But it was Eleanor's attention that Daniel found himself most aware of, the way she leaned forward slightly when he spoke, how her eyes never wandered, the small nod she gave when he described finding the pressed flowers and making his decision. After supper, Eleanor walked with him back toward the livery. The evening air bit cold, and their breath formed clouds in the space between them. Silver Creek lay quiet under its blanket of snow, lights twinkling in windows where families gathered against the mountain night. Eleanor spoke suddenly, as if the words had been building pressure inside her. The town needed help, she explained. The schoolhouse roof leaked in 3 places, and she couldn't afford proper repairs. The stove smoked because the chimney needed cleaning. The shelves where she kept the children's books were coming apart at the joints. She paused, then asked if he knew anything about carpentry. Daniel thought about his years working ranches, building fence lines, and patching barn roofs, and making things work with whatever materials came to hand. He knew enough to fix a leaking roof and clean a chimney. Shelves he could manage with a hammer and some nails. Eleanor quickly added that she couldn't pay much. The school board provided a small maintenance budget, but it barely covered firewood and supplies. Daniel heard himself offer to work for just enough to cover his boarding and his horse's keep while the work got done. Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face him fully. In the lamplight spilling from a nearby window, her face held an expression of mingled hope and uncertainty. She asked why he would do that, noting he had already gone far beyond what anyone would expect. He could leave tomorrow and still be the most decent man she had ever encountered. Daniel considered the question seriously. Why was he offering to stay in this small mountain town where he knew no one? But looking at Eleanor Grant, this woman who had left behind comfort to teach children in a frontier town, who treasured pressed flowers and her mother's handwritten notes, Daniel realized the answer was simple. He told her honestly that he hadn't had a purpose in a long time. Her schoolhouse needed fixing, and he could use something worth fixing. Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment, and Daniel saw the exact instant she made her decision. She accepted his offer, adding that the children would be thrilled to have their bookshelves repaired. They shook hands formally, though the gesture felt charged with something more than a simple business arrangement. Daniel promised to start the next day, and Eleanor smiled that transforming smile again. For the first time since leaving his family's ranch, Daniel felt like he had arrived somewhere that mattered. Chapter 4. What We Carry Forward. One day became 3, then a week, then 2. Daniel fixed the schoolhouse roof with tar paper and new shingles, hauled firewood, and stacked it properly, cleaned the chimney until smoke drew cleanly upward, and rebuilt the shelves with proper joints that would hold weight without complaint. Each evening, they worked together until lamplight sent them home to their separate quarters. They talked while they worked, long conversations that ranged from childhood memories to philosophical questions about education and purpose. Eleanor told him about her mother's final months, how she had used those weeks to prepare Eleanor for a world she wouldn't see, filling the poetry book with notes and pressed flowers like messages in bottles sent to an unknown future. Daniel shared stories he had never told anyone, how he blamed himself for losing the family ranch, thinking if he had only worked harder, he could have prevented the foreclosure, how his mother had died 6 months after losing their home. And though the doctor called it pneumonia, Daniel knew it was grief that had hollowed her out from inside. The town noticed their growing closeness. Mrs. Peterson made pointed comments about nice young men and suitable matches. The children began asking Miss Grant if Mr. Cole was her beau, and Eleanor deflected with practiced ease while color rose in her cheeks. Then the letter arrived. Eleanor brought it to the schoolhouse one afternoon, her face pale and hands trembling. Her father had tracked her down. He was giving her one final chance: return home by Christmas, marry Andrew Thornton, and be welcomed back with full support. Refuse and face permanent disownment. No inheritance, no family connections, no assistance if she fell on hard times. Eleanor stared out the window at snow falling gently over Silver Creek's Main Street. The sensible choice was obvious: go home, marry a man who could provide security and live comfortably. But that life didn't fit who she had become. Daniel joined her at the window. He told her about losing everything 2 years ago, about drifting aimlessly until he found a book on a train platform and followed it here. For the first time since losing the ranch, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Eleanor whispered that she was scared of choosing wrong, of being alone. Daniel reached up slowly and brushed tears from her face. If she chose to stay, she wouldn't face it alone. He wasn't asking her to choose him, just saying that if she chose this life, teaching children and living on her own terms, she would have someone standing beside her. Eleanor closed the distance between them, her lips finding his in a kiss that tasted of salt and determination and hope. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his chest and made her decision. She was staying, choosing the schoolhouse and the children and the uncertain future. Choosing him. They married that spring in a simple ceremony performed by the circuit judge. Daniel helped establish a lending library in the general store, while Eleanor taught 3 generations of Silver Creek children. The poetry book lived on their shelf, accumulating new pressed flowers that marked moments worth preserving. Their wedding day, the first spring in their new home, celebrations, and quiet everyday miracles that filled their lives together. Years later, when their time came, they were buried on the hillside overlooking Silver Creek. Their gravestone bore a simple inscription: they carried what mattered. The poetry book passed through generations, worn nearly to pieces but still treasured. And beside the original inscription from Eleanor's mother, someone had added in careful script, "She dropped this at a train station." He carried it 100 miles to return it. Sometimes the longest journey leads us home. If this story touched your heart, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, would you ride 100 miles for love? Thanks for listening.